Millionaire forces Waitress to perform piano at party to embarrass her. Her talent shocks everyone. Sometimes life throws challenges your way, challenges so unexpected and overwhelming that they seem impossible to overcome. They push you, they break you, and yet, in the most surprising ways, they reveal your true strength. This is one of those stories, a tale of resilience, courage, and hidden potential that no one saw coming, not even the person living it. Imagine this: a young woman named Emma working long hours at a busy diner just to make ends meet. Day after day, she serves tables with a polite smile, hiding the exhaustion that weighs heavily on her shoulders. She has dreams, big dreams, but life has always seemed to conspire against her. From a young age, Emma loved music. The piano was her escape, her sanctuary, her way of expressing the emotions she couldn't put into words. But reality has a way of silencing dreams when survival takes precedence. Emma grew up in a small, working-class neighborhood where opportunities were few and struggles were plenty. Her father, a mechanic, and her mother, a homemaker, worked tirelessly to give her a better life. They did the best they could, but piano lessons and fancy instruments were luxuries they couldn't afford for long. Still, Emma found ways to learn. She practiced on an old, slightly out-of-tune piano at a community center, pouring every ounce of her passion into those worn keys. But life has a way of pulling you away from what you love. As Emma got older, the responsibilities piled on. Her father's health began to decline, bills started stacking up, and she had to step in to help the family make ends meet. College became a distant dream, and with it, her hopes of pursuing a career in music. She took on any job she could find: cashier, cleaner, waitress, anything that would keep the lights on and food on the table. Her piano sat untouched, gathering dust in the corner of her tiny apartment, a constant reminder of the dreams she had shelved. Then came the opportunity that would change everything, though Emma couldn't have known it at the time. It was just another shift at the diner, another long night of carrying trays and pretending not to notice the impatient glances of her customers. That's when she overheard a conversation about a high-profile event in town, a lavish party hosted by one of the wealthiest men in the city. Emma didn't think much of it until her manager approached her with a proposition. "Emma, we're short on staff for tomorrow night's big catering gig," he said, looking more stressed than usual. "It's good money. Fancy crowd. Think you can handle it?" Emma hesitated. She wasn't a fan of these high society events. The people were often rude, treating the staff as invisible or worse, as entertainment for their amusement. But the pay was too good to pass up, and Emma needed every penny she could earn. "Sure," she said with a small sigh. "I'll take it." The next evening, Emma found herself standing in the grand ballroom of a sprawling mansion, the kind of place she had only ever seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting the golden glow of the room. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, sipping champagne and laughing as if the weight of the world didn't exist. Emma couldn't help but feel out of place. In her plain black uniform and sensible shoes, she was a stark contrast to the glittering extravagance around her. As she carried a tray of hors d'oeuvres through the crowd, she noticed the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was breathtaking, sleek, black, and polished to perfection. Emma's heart ached at the sight of it. She couldn't remember the last time she had touched a piano, let alone one as beautiful as this. She quickly turned her attention back to her work, not wanting to get caught staring. Little did she know, someone had noticed her. A man standing near the piano with an air of arrogance and wealth watched her with a sly smirk. This man was the host of the evening, a self-made millionaire who enjoyed flaunting his success. He thrived on power and control, always looking for ways to entertain himself at the expense of others. And tonight, He had found his next target. Emma had no idea that the course of her life was about to change, all because of that man's cruel intentions and her own hidden brilliance. The lavish party was a spectacle, the kind of event people talked about for weeks. It was the millionaire's annual celebration, an over-the-top affair meant to showcase his wealth and social clout. Every detail was designed to dazzle. Towering floral arrangements adorned every table. Live performers roamed the crowd juggling flaming torches, and an extravagant buffet stretched the length of the ballroom. Guests sipped on champagne so expensive that most of them couldn't pronounce its name. Every corner of the mansion seemed to glisten under the glow of the crystal chandeliers. It wasn't just a party, it was a stage, and everyone in attendance was expected to play their part. Emma felt like an outsider in this world, and she was. As she moved through the crowd with her tray, she caught snippets of conversations, discussions about art collections, hedge funds, and exotic vacations. It was a stark reminder of how far removed her own life was from theirs. The mansion itself seemed to mock her humble existence. She had grown up in a small apartment where she could hear her neighbors arguing through the walls. Here, the rooms were so vast that even a whisper could get lost in the space. The guests didn't pay much attention to Emma or the other staff. To them, the servers were invisible, mere accessories to their indulgence. But Emma had become good at blending in, at making herself small and unnoticeable. She had perfected the art of polite smiles and quiet efficiency, ensuring she could earn her paycheck and leave without any trouble. Tonight, though, trouble was looking for her. The host of the party, Mr. Griffin, was standing by the grand piano. He was the kind of man who thrived on spectacle, who loved being the center of attention. In his tailored suit and diamond-encrusted cufflinks, he looked every bit the self-made millionaire he claimed to be. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who enjoyed wielding power, who found amusement in making others feel small. Mr. Griffin had been watching Emma. It wasn't her uniform or her tray of hors d'oeuvres that caught his eye. It was the fleeting glance she had given the piano. He had seen it before, that look of longing, of admiration. It was subtle, but he recognized it. To him, it was an opportunity. As Emma made her way across the room, she suddenly heard his voice, loud and commanding, cutting through the hum of conversation. "You there, waitress?" Emma froze, every eye in the room now on her. She turned slowly, her stomach tightening as she realized he was speaking to her. Mr. Griffin was beckoning her over, his smirk growing wider with every step she took toward him. The crowd began to murmur, curious about what was happening. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Emma," she replied quietly, her cheeks flushing under the weight of so many stares. "Well, Emma," he said, gesturing toward the piano, "you seemed very interested in this earlier. Tell me, do you play?" Emma hesitated. She didn't know how to respond. Admitting that she played might invite more attention than she wanted, but lying felt wrong. "A little," she said finally, keeping her voice steady. "A little?" Mr. Griffin repeated, feigning surprise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a musician in our midst. How lucky are we?" The crowd chuckled, some with genuine amusement, others out of sheer politeness. Emma could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, but Mr. Griffin wasn't finished. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" he said, stepping aside and motioning toward the piano. Emma's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. Playing in front of this crowd, under these circumstances, was the last thing she wanted to do. She shook her head slightly, trying to deflect. "Oh, I couldn't," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm just here to work." "Nonsense," Mr. Griffin replied, his voice booming. "You're among friends. Don't be shy." The tone of his words made it clear that this wasn't a request. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Emma looked around, her mind scrambling for a way out. She caught the gaze of her manager, who gave her a nervous nod as if to say, "Just do it and get it over with." Feeling cornered, Emma took a deep breath and stepped toward the piano. Her hands were shaking as she slid onto the bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. The room was deathly silent now, every eye fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their expectations. Behind her, Mr. Griffin smirked, clearly enjoying her discomfort. He leaned toward one of his friends and whispered, "This should be good." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her nerves. She hadn't played in years, not like this. The last time she performed in front of an audience was a lifetime ago, in a high school talent show. But this wasn't a high school auditorium. This was a room full of strangers, most of whom were waiting to see her fail. As she placed her hands on the keys, she could hear the faintest sound of someone snickering in the back of the room. The laughter stung, but it also lit a spark inside her. If they wanted to laugh, fine. But they wouldn't laugh at her failure. No, if they were going to laugh, it would be because they couldn't believe what they were about to hear. Emma took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound rang out, clear and pure, cutting through the tension in the room. She began to play, her fingers moving instinctively, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. The melody was soft at first, delicate, but it grew with each passing moment, filling the room with a wave of emotion that was impossible to ignore. The crowd, once poised to mock her, stood in stunned silence, their smirks fading into expressions of awe. Even Mr. Griffin, who had orchestrated the entire scene for his amusement, found himself at a loss for words. Emma played with a passion that seemed to defy explanation, pouring every ounce of her heart into the music. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of what would turn out to be an unforgettable night. Emma's fingers hovered over the piano keys for a split second, trembling under the weight of the moment. She could feel every gaze in the room fixed on her, every whisper and murmur swirling around her like a storm. Her breath hitched as she looked down at the pristine ivory keys, the memory of her childhood practice sessions flashing before her eyes. This wasn't the rickety, out-of-tune piano she had grown up with. This was a masterpiece, perfect in every way, and yet it felt foreign, almost unapproachable. For a moment, she thought about standing up, shaking her head and walking away. She could tell her manager she wasn't feeling well, or maybe even make up an excuse to leave the party entirely. But deep down, Emma knew that wasn't an option. If she walked away now, she'd carry the regret forever. Something inside her told her this moment mattered, that this wasn't just another shift or another night. It was a test of everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had ever worked for, and despite the fear coursing through her veins, she wasn't going to fail. Her hands finally descended onto the keys, and the first note rang out. It was soft, hesitant, almost like a whisper. The sound seemed to hang in the air, silencing the whispers and muffled laughter around the room. Emma's fingers began to move, slow at first, as she found her rhythm. The melody grew, blossoming into something that was both hauntingly beautiful and heartbreakingly raw. The crowd, who had moments earlier been poised to mock her, began to lean in, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. The music was unlike anything they had expected. It wasn't flashy or overly complex. It was simple, honest, and filled with an emotion so deep that it felt as though Emma was telling a story through the piano. As the notes flowed from her fingertips, Emma felt a shift inside her. The nerves, the fear, the humiliation, they all melted away, replaced by something far more powerful: freedom. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't someone struggling to make ends meet, or someone living in the shadow of her forgotten dreams. She was an artist, pouring her soul into the music and letting it speak for her in a way words never could. The guests were mesmerized. Some of them exchanged glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others stood motionless, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. Even Mr. Griffin, the man who had orchestrated this moment to humiliate her, found himself transfixed. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by an expression of confusion, then awe, as though he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Emma's music swelled, filling every corner of the massive ballroom. The melody shifted, taking on a life of its own. It was joyful and triumphant one moment, then soft and mournful the next. It was as if Emma was pouring out every emotion she had ever felt, every struggle, every triumph, every heartbreak into the song. And as the crowd listened, they felt it too. The music reached places inside them that they had forgotten existed, stirring memories and feelings they didn't know they still carried. Tears welled up in the eyes of a woman standing near the front of the room. A man in the back, who hadn't stopped scrolling through his phone all night, put it away and stood frozen, unable to look away. Even the staff, who had been quietly serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres, stopped what they were doing to listen. The entire room was captivated, spellbound by the waitress who had just moments earlier been invisible to them. But for Emma, none of that mattered. She wasn't playing for them. She wasn't playing to impress Mr. Griffin or to prove herself to the wealthy elite in the room. She was playing for herself. Every note, every chord was a piece of her soul, and for the first time in years, she felt alive. As the final notes of her song echoed through the room, Emma let her hands fall gently to her lap. For a moment, there was silence. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid to disturb the magic she had just created. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with one person, then another, until the entire room was on their feet, clapping and cheering louder than they had all night. Emma sat there, stunned, as the realization of what had just happened washed over her. She had done it. She had taken the moment that was meant to break her and turned it into something extraordinary. The applause thundered around her, but she barely noticed. She was still lost in the music, the emotions of it all, the sense of freedom she had found in those few fleeting minutes. Mr. Griffin, who had been the architect of this cruel spectacle, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. He had expected laughter, ridicule, maybe even tears. But instead, he had been given a performance so breathtaking that it had rendered even him speechless. For once, the man who always had a witty remark or cutting comment to make was at a loss for words. Emma stood from the piano bench, her hands trembling, and turned to face the crowd. She expected to feel embarrassed, maybe even overwhelmed, but instead, she felt strong. This was her moment, and she had earned it. As the applause continued, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. A smile that spoke of triumph, of resilience, of a dream that refused to die. But what Emma didn't realize, what no one in that room could have anticipated, was that this night was only the beginning. As the applause thundered around her, Emma's heart raced. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully hit her yet, but she could feel it building, an emotional tide rising within her. The room, once filled with whispers and judgmental glances, was now alight with admiration and awe. People who moments ago had barely noticed her existence were now leaning forward, their faces etched with expressions of wonder. It was surreal, like stepping into a dream she didn't dare imagine for herself. But amidst the applause, Emma's mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions: relief, pride, disbelief. All of it mingled with the lingering sting of why she had been put in this position in the first place. This wasn't a moment she had chosen. It was one that had been forced upon her, designed to humiliate and ridicule her. And yet, she had turned it into something beautiful, something triumphant. As she stood from the piano, she glanced at Mr. Griffin, the man who had orchestrated this moment. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. For the first time that evening, he looked unsure of himself. Emma held his gaze for a moment, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, before turning to the rest of the room. She wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of knowing how much this had shaken her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The crowd erupted into another wave of applause, some even whistling and shouting their admiration. Emma nodded politely, but she didn't linger. She stepped away from the piano, retreating toward the back of the room where she could catch her breath and process what had just happened. But the night wasn't done with her yet. As she moved through the crowd, people began to approach her, their faces glowing with excitement and curiosity. "That was incredible," one woman gushed, her diamond earrings catching the light as she clutched Emma's arm. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "You've got to tell us," another man chimed in. "Are you a professional? Do you perform somewhere?" Emma struggled to find the words. These people who had moments ago seen her as nothing more than a waitress were now treating her like she was the star of the evening. It was overwhelming, and part of her wanted to disappear into the background again, to retreat to the safety of anonymity. But another part of her, the part that had dreamed of a moment like this for as long as she could remember, wanted to soak it all in. As she tried to navigate the sudden flood of attention, a voice rose above the crowd. "Excuse me, everyone." The room fell quiet as a man stepped forward. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet confidence. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it was his eyes that caught Emma's attention. Sharp, intelligent, and filled with a kind of warmth that immediately put her at ease. "I couldn't help but notice your performance," he said, addressing Emma directly. "It was extraordinary." Emma felt her cheeks flush under his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly, unsure of where this was going. The man extended a hand. "My name is James Carter. I'm a music producer." The air seemed to shift around her. A music producer. Emma's mind raced, trying to process the significance of what he had just said. She had heard stories of people being discovered in the most unexpected ways, but she had never believed it could happen to her. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, offering her his hand. "I don't say this lightly," James continued, his voice steady and sincere. "You have a rare gift. I would love the chance to work with you, to help you share your talent with the world." Emma blinked, struggling to comprehend the enormity of his words. Was this really happening? After years of working dead-end jobs, of pushing her dreams aside, was someone finally seeing her for who she truly was? Before she could respond, the crowd began to buzz with excitement. People whispered to one another, their eyes darting between Emma and James. Even Mr. Griffin, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, seemed taken aback. He had planned to humiliate her, to make her the butt of a joke, but instead, she had become the star of the evening, and now, potentially, a star beyond this room. Emma looked at James, her heart pounding. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," he said with a gentle smile. "You don't have to decide right now, but I'd be honored to discuss it further. Here's my card." He handed her a sleek business card, the weight of it in her hand feeling almost surreal. As James stepped back, giving her space to process, the applause began again, this time softer, but no less sincere. Emma stood there, the card clutched tightly in her hand as the enormity of the moment washed over her. This wasn't just a fleeting compliment or a polite gesture. This was an opportunity, one that could change her life forever. But even as the excitement swirled around her, Emma couldn't shake the complex mix of emotions inside her. There was joy, yes, and hope, but also a lingering bitterness. She had been forced into this moment, pushed into the spotlight not out of kindness, but out of cruelty. Mr. Griffin's smug face flashed in her mind, and she felt a surge of defiance. She hadn't just survived his attempt to humiliate her, she had thrived. And now she had the chance to prove, not just to him, but to herself, that her talent was worth something. As the night wore on, Emma found herself surrounded by people eager to speak with her, to ask questions, to offer their praise. But through it all, her mind kept returning to the piano, to the music, to the way it had felt to finally share that part of herself with the world. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something big, something life-changing. And in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. As the night pressed on, the energy in the room shifted. The party, once filled with shallow laughter and meaningless conversations, had taken on a different tone. Guests continued to approach Emma, their earlier indifference replaced with genuine curiosity and admiration. To them, she was no longer a nameless waitress, but the star of the evening. Yet, amidst the sudden whirlwind of attention, Emma struggled to process what had just unfolded. She held the business card James Carter had handed her, her fingers trembling slightly. The name seemed to glow under the ballroom's golden lights, each embossed letter a reminder of the weight it carried. A music producer, a real one, had recognized her talent. He had seen something in her that she had almost forgotten existed, and yet doubt lingered at the edges of her mind, whispering that this was all too good to be true. But before Emma could get lost in her thoughts, a figure approached her from across the room. It was Mr. Griffin. His once arrogant demeanor seemed shaken, his expression unreadable as he stopped a few feet away. The smirk that had accompanied his cruel challenge earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by something far more subdued. "Well," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "I must admit that was, unexpected." Emma stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Was he apologizing? Was he trying to take credit for her moment? Or was this yet another attempt to assert control? She decided to let him speak first, waiting to see where this would go. "You certainly surprised everyone," he continued, his words careful, measured. "I suppose I underestimated you." There it was, a backhanded compliment, an admission wrapped in ego. Emma felt a flicker of anger rise within her, but she kept her expression calm. She wasn't going to let him reduce this moment to something as petty as his need for validation. "I wasn't trying to surprise anyone," she said evenly. "I was just being myself." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Mr. Griffin looked as though he might respond. But instead, he nodded curtly and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Emma let out a quiet breath, relief washing over her. She had stood her ground, and it felt good. But the night wasn't done revealing its surprises. As Emma stepped back into the room, still holding James Carter's card, she noticed a small group gathering around the piano. It was the same piano she had just played, now the centerpiece of the evening in a way it hadn't been before. The guests who had dismissed it as decoration earlier were now treating it with reverence, as though it carried a magic only Emma could unlock. James was among the group, talking animatedly with a few other guests. When he spotted Emma, he broke away and walked toward her, his smile warm and inviting. "Emma," he said, his tone brimming with enthusiasm. "I've been speaking with a few colleagues here tonight. They were just as moved by your performance as I was. It seems you've made quite the impression." Emma blinked, her heart racing. "Colleagues?" James nodded. Yes, some very influential people in the music industry. One of them even runs a program that mentors emerging artists. If you're interested, I'd love to introduce you. The offer was overwhelming. Emma could hardly believe what she was hearing. For years, she had worked tirelessly, quietly, wondering if her dreams would ever mean anything to anyone but herself. And now, in a single night, doors were opening that she hadn't even dared to knock on. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice filled with emotion. Say yes, James said with a grin. You have a gift, Emma. It's rare and it's powerful. Don't let this opportunity pass you by. Before she could overthink it, Emma nodded. Yes, I'd love to meet them. James beamed. That's the spirit. He led her back to the group by the piano, where Emma found herself surrounded by strangers who treated her like an equal, like an artist. They asked her about her background, her inspirations, her dreams. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a waitress or a struggling musician, but as someone with something valuable to offer the world. And then, just when Emma thought the night couldn't possibly hold any more surprises, James turned to her with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, I've been thinking about that performance of yours. It wasn't just technical skill. It was raw, emotional, unforgettable. If you're open to it, I'd like to help you develop a full repertoire. Imagine a stage, a spotlight, and an audience who's there just for you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. A stage? An audience? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, but as she looked around the room at the faces of the people who had been so moved by her music, she realized something important. She was ready. I'd like that, she said, her voice steady with newfound confidence. I'd like that a lot. The guests around her cheered, their excitement infectious. James smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride and determination. Good. Then let's make it happen. As the night wore on, Emma felt a transformation within herself. She had arrived at the party as someone trying to survive, to stay unnoticed. Now, she was leaving as someone who had reclaimed her dream, who had dared to be seen. And though the path ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, Emma knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face it head-on. But even as she basked in the glow of the moment, there was a quiet voice in the back of her mind, a whisper of disbelief. How had it all come to this? How had one act of cruelty turned into the opportunity of a lifetime? Emma didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing. This was only the beginning. And with that thought, she held her head high, stepped into the night, and prepared to embrace the future waiting for her. As the night came to an end, Emma stood outside the mansion, staring up at the glittering stars that blanketed the night sky. The cool air brushed against her skin, grounding her after the whirlwind of emotions she had just experienced. Inside, the grand party continued, but Emma had slipped away, needing a moment of solitude to process everything. In her hand, she still clutched James Carter's business card, its weight feeling heavier than it should. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a promise, a doorway to a life she had only ever dreamed of. She replayed the evening in her mind, the way her fingers had danced across the piano keys, the stunned silence that followed her performance, and the flood of applause that had lifted her spirits in a way she hadn't felt in years. But more than the applause, it was the opportunity that had ignited something inside her, a belief that maybe, just maybe, her dreams weren't as impossible as they had once seemed. As Emma took a deep breath, a quiet thought entered her mind. What if she had said no? What if she had let fear win? She almost had. The memory of her hesitation, of the anxiety that had nearly paralyzed her before she played, was still fresh. But she hadn't let it stop her. She had taken a leap of faith, and that single act of courage had changed everything. For years, she had convinced herself that her dreams were out of reach, that her talent was something private, something that didn't matter to the rest of the world. But tonight had proven her wrong. Her music had moved people, truly moved them, and that realization filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. As the stars twinkled above, Emma made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let this moment go to waste. She would seize this opportunity with everything she had, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible. Back inside, the party was winding down. Guests were leaving, their conversations still buzzing about the unexpected star of the evening. Emma returned to gather her things, her uniform feeling a little less heavy now, her steps a little lighter. She caught sight of Mr. Griffin in the corner, speaking to a few remaining guests. Their expressions were polite, but disinterested, a stark contrast to the enthusiasm they had shown Emma just moments ago. For a fleeting second, Emma wondered if she should say something to him, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She didn't need his validation. The night had given her something far more valuable than his approval, a chance to reclaim her dreams. As she left the mansion, Emma felt a sense of closure. The humiliation she had feared earlier in the evening had turned into a triumph, a reminder of her strength and resilience. The girl who had walked into that party, burdened by self-doubt, wasn't the same person walking out. This, Emma, was stronger. She believed in herself again. The following morning, Emma woke up to a flood of messages on her phone. Somehow, clips of her performance had made their way online, and they were spreading fast. People from all over were commenting on her talent, sharing her story, and calling her an inspiration. One comment in particular caught her eye. "I've always loved music, but never thought I was good enough to share it. Seeing you play has made me want to try again. Thank you for reminding me that dreams are worth fighting for." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she read those words. It was a reminder that her journey wasn't just about her. Her story could inspire others, could show them that even in the face of doubt and adversity, it was possible to rise above. She took to social media, posting a simple message. "Last night changed my life. Thank you to everyone who believed in me and to those who are just discovering my story. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never give up on your dreams, no matter how far away they seem. Sometimes the moments that challenge us the most are the ones that reveal who we truly are." To you, the viewer watching this video right now, Emma's story isn't just about a waitress playing a piano at a fancy party. It's about courage, resilience, and the power of believing in yourself. It's about taking chances, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Emma could have let fear stop her, but she didn't. And because of that, her life changed forever. Think about your own dreams. What's that one thing you've always wanted to do but never dared to try? What's holding you back? Maybe it's fear, doubt, or the voice in your head that says, "You're not good enough." But let Emma's story be a reminder. You are good enough. Your talent, your passion, your voice, they matter. And you never know who might be watching, who might be inspired by your bravery. If this story moved you, take a moment to comment below and share your own dream. What's the one thing you've always wanted to do? And what's one small step you can take toward making it happen? Let's create a community of dreamers who lift each other up. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like Emma's. Every week, we share tales of everyday people who overcome extraordinary odds. You never know. One day, the story we tell might just be yours. Because like Emma, you have something incredible to share with the world. So go out there and make it happen. And when you do, we'll be here, cheering you on every step of the way.